Michael, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, Elle? Thanks for having me on. I love what you're doing with this podcast, by the way. I think the world needs better product marketing, and there's really no manual for what we do. So a lot of respect for what you're doing here on this pod.
Thank you so much. All right, let's dive right in. Okay, so category creation is one of the most ambitious things a PMM can take on. Not everybody gets to do it, but I would argue that almost all PMMs get to influence their position in the market. So before we tackle this head on, and before we jump into the case study, help give us some definition around what does it mean to have a market category exactly?
Yeah, I think simply put, a market category is the position in your customer's mind where your product plays. And I think as like humans, we naturally want to categorize things as a way of helping us make sense of our world, right? And we do this kind of stuff all the time. Like if I asked you what Haagen-Dazs is, you would probably say it's, super premium ice cream. Or if I asked you what, a BMW 3 Series is, you would probably say it's a luxury compact sedan. And obviously those are both B2C examples, but I think, the exact same truth holds in the B2B world. And I personally think category creation is one of the most important things that you can do to set your company up for, long-term durable growth. Like we're all familiar with the old Field of Dreams adage that if you build it, they will come, based on the idea that if you launch an amazing product, it's just going to sell itself. And sometimes that works, but I think a lot of the time it doesn't, right? And it's because it's not good enough just to create a great product. You also need to frame the category and create the market in which you play.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking all the way back to my college days. I majored in psychology in undergrad, and I remember learning about heuristics and exactly as you were referring, creating labels and categories just helps our brains and our minds work faster and more efficiently. So our jobs as product marketers are to help our customers make those connections for them. So let's now dig a little bit into the case study itself. I know you have a few different examples of this from your career. So let's start with you walking us through a time when you helped create or shape a market category.
Sure. So we'll do a little bit of a throwback here. I started my career out of school as employee number 8 at a pre-Series A, pre-revenue startup called Janrain. And I spent 6 years there as we scaled up to about 200 employees, 15 million in recurring annual revenue. And when I first joined, we had just built and launched our flagship product, which was this thing called social login. Like, have you ever visited a website, where you can use your existing Google or Facebook identity to create an account on that site? Yeah. So it's a nice time saver, right? Over needing to fill out a registration form from scratch and remember yet another username,
password
combination.
Oh God, there's nothing worse.
Totally. And this was a long time ago. So this is like when we were still writing down our login details on Post-it notes instead of, using something like 1Password. So anyway, this company I worked at, we basically invented that technology. And pretty early on after launching this social login product, we realized that the market problem wasn't big enough for this product alone in order to build a big company around it. There, simply put, there wasn't going to be enough money in that banana stand for us to reach escape velocity. And we needed to think bigger. So we got to work basically building out a broader product portfolio, including a website registration as a service product and a customer profile database to enable digital marketers to be able to store demographic and psychographic data for people who created an account on their website. And this was actually all kind of new to the world technology at the time, for companies to be able to buy something like that as a service instead of building it from scratch. And we really only had one competitor, a company out of the Bay Area called Gigya, that was doing anything close to what we were doing. And initially we tried positioning this, new portfolio as a user management platform for the social web, but it was kind of a mouthful. It totally wasn't barbecue speak or customer language. And it really didn't connote any value. So it just didn't stick. And so we got to work in 2013, 2014, basically defining and building a category as the space where our products played. And eventually we coined and led the creation of the customer identity and access management category. And that's a market that our competitors later standardized on. Analyst firms who covered digital marketing technology have since adopted and still used to this day.
It's a crazy huge market now.
Yeah, and it's a term that's still used today to refer to products for public companies like Okta and Microsoft and AWS, for
Cisco.
example. Yeah, totally. So I ended up moving on, to a new gig at a company called Puppet after about 6 years. But our little startup got acquired by Akamai, which is a $3 billion public company, and essentially became Akamai's flagship customer identity and access management product offering.
Awesome. Okay, wow, what an incredible story. So, I would love to take this case study and now let's create some practical steps that a PMM would take to shape the market category for their own product. So, I guess in your mind, what's the first decision that a PMM would need to make? Is it really about creating something that's brand new? Is it redefining an existing shape, a space? Is it attaching your product to, a category that already exists? Like, I guess, like, help us understand what the PMM needs to do first.
Yeah, I think you kind of nailed the decision tree, basically. I think the first question you need to ask yourself as a PMM is, one, is my company introducing a new to the world thing where we're creating a brand new market category where none previously existed? Two, are we solving an existing problem in a new way in order to differentiate from incumbents? And actually, what we're doing is redefining an existing category that we already play in. Or third, are we expanding into an adjacent market that already exists and basically trying to reposition our company to play in this category either through, new product development or through acquisition? So, I think you have to kind of start thinking long term and asking questions like, hey, in 3 to 5 years, what do we want to be known for, as a company by our buyers?
Yeah, and just the way that you were describing the decision tree, it sounds like it anchors on what the customer's problem is. And is it a problem that has not been solved, thus a net new market, a problem that is currently being solved, but your company's currently not solving for it or is new to solving it? So that would be kind of shifting the market or, something around that nature is what it really feels like. And that would require some deep understanding on what your customers' pains are and really knowing the problem that your company is solving for or will solve for as the company evolves. So I guess once you've made that call and you realize that you need to go forth and maybe create a new category, we'll say just for the sake of creating this, kind of these practical steps, what would step two be after you kind of work your way through the decision tree?
Yeah, I think, from there, everything starts with positioning and getting your category narrative actually written down on paper. And so, first, I guess, like, if you're wondering why this is even a PMM thing in the first place and why we're talking about it on this podcast, I would argue it's because category creation at its core is a positioning exercise. And I think every product marketer needs to make it their business to be experts at positioning. And to do so really requires like a mastery of, your market, your buyers and their needs and understanding of what makes you different. And then also the ability to actually craft a strong point of view that can influence others on your thinking. And, in terms of kind of the framework that we use, like you and I talked about this actually earlier, like I'm a big fan of Andy Raskin's thinking on narrative design. Like go look him up on LinkedIn if you haven't heard of him. He writes a lot of great thought leadership around how to craft sales messaging and B2B messaging that resonates. But we basically used a lot of his thinking to structure our category narrative at JanRain. And I've, kind of run the same playbook at Puppet and New Relic and my current role at Splunk. And I'll sort of stub out like the 5 main sections of that narrative. And then maybe we can kind of, I can dig back into my, in the history book and we can talk about how we did it at JanRain. But the first step is really to name a big change in the world. And this is basically the market context in which your customers live. And, as a PMM, like you want to establish credibility and empathy by showing that you understand your customer's world and the changes that they're experiencing and how those might impact them in the future. And then next, you want to identify the problem that change creates and its impact and the consequence of not solving it. And I think this is probably the most important step in building a category because from my experience, the companies that frame the problem the most persuasively, those are the ones that actually like define categories and win. And they're the ones who get customers to like buy into their vision for solving it, So then I think the third step is really about depositioning the status quo. And this is super important because it's what really reinforces the need to explore new ways of thinking while sort of poking holes in the old way and the incumbents you displace. And this is kind of the part of your narrative that gets people out of do nothing mode or like, why can't I just, continue operating the way I always have? And then next, kind of fourth step of the narrative is really about describing the promised land. This is again an Andy Raskin concept. You can think of it as like the overarching need or the ideal state that you want your customers to be able to get to. And it's not a laundry list of features. I don't even think you should be like talking about yourself here or your company or your products. This is all about getting your customers to buy into the importance of solving the problem and to paint a vision for what great looks like. And then last kind of step or section of the narrative is really about framing your category then as the thing that's needed to help your customers get to the promised land. And this is where I think you actually can start pivoting to talking about yourself a little bit, and where it becomes really important to sort of state like the requirements or the capabilities that are needed to get there. And so that's really a golden opportunity for you to kind of like inception your differentiators in the minds of a customer.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for walking us through that. You reminded me why I love the Andy Raskin framework for narrative design so much. It's so others oriented. It's very customer focused. As you pointed out, majority of the framework is entirely about the customer and the market and the problems that they're facing. You don't even introduce you or your product until the very end. And the other thing that you mentioned that's part of the framework that I just wanted to call out is what I have in my personal positioning framework is that the ineffective alternatives, right? Like making sure you understand like the status quo and like why that doesn't work, like the old way of doing things, why that doesn't work, and wrapping that up in the perspective of the customer. So I'm really eager to hear an example of the walkthrough. Are you able to walk us through an example from the identity access management product category, I guess, that you created?
I'll do my best with the caveat that this is like, dating back into 2014 mindset. But I think you nailed it, by the way, on your point. Like, when you think about sort of structuring sales messaging as like kind of, why change, why now, why us? A lot of times the why us isn't necessarily us versus a competitor. It's like us versus status quo and doing nothing. And, B2B vendors lose a lot of deals to basically do nothing. Like the customer made no decision. And so I think that's where it's really important to kind of frame that promised land and to deposition the status quo to sort of like light a fire in prospects to want to change.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, when we did this at Janrain and kind of pioneered the customer identity and access management space, we basically applied this like this kind of category narrative structure to building out our own narrative and then using it to activate it and get the market to kind of standardize on it. And as I remember, at least like the change that we kind of articulated was like, hey, if you're a digital marketer in 2014. Your customers are now interacting with your brand across an ever exploding number of devices and touch points. This was like early in the days of everybody having a smartphone and starting to like transact online via mobile devices, in addition to like websites on their computer. And the old way of being able to like kind of get a view of your customer and their behavior and their activity was basically by like cookies that were attached to a web browser. And so when you think about, consumers switching devices, the old way of tracking consumer behavior through cookies like no longer works, because if I go to your website on my personal laptop, but then I go to your website a day later on my smartphone, you would have no way of knowing if that was the same me, in both instances. So we basically position that as like the change in the world and then frame the customer problem as essentially like you have this fragmented view of your customer's identity, and it's really hard to be able to, see who your customers are, understand what makes them tick, and understand behaviors that they're taking, interacting with your brand to help you better serve them and better engage them. And we really kind of framed like the, tracking cookies that were device specific as like the villain to be able to deposition the status quo, if you will. And so we framed up like the promised land as essentially being able to have like a unified identity for your customers and being able to understand their demographic data, their psychographic data, behaviors they were taking as they were interacting with your brand in a unified view. And that the solution was really getting people to register and create an identity on your website, and then having the ability to like understand, psychographic data around their interests that, you would get from like their Facebook profile if they logged into your site using their Facebook identity. And then to be able to also start to correlate behavioral data that, that people were taking as they were interacting with your brand with that demographic and psychographic data. So that was kind of the promised land that we framed. And then, we sort of described the category that's needed was really around customer identity and access management, being able to like unify the identities for your customers, but then also control access, in a way that was secure around like how they could interact with your website and with your brand and transact and that kind of stuff. And then actually framed up our differentiators as like the requirements or the key capabilities that you needed in order to get to that promised land.
Yes. Okay. So in your example, so much of the narrative was about what's happening in your customer's world and how their behaviors are changing. Your customers is what I meant. And then it evolved to what that translates to for your ideal customers, right? Like how they can either seize this change as an opportunity or how they would be kind of left behind as the world is shifting. So perfect example of using the framework. Thank you so much for walking us through that. Okay, so now I want to jump back to then the steps that a PMM would need to take. So we talked about the decision tree, and then we said just hypothetically say we're going forth with creating a brand new market category. And you said the first thing that a PMM would need to do then is to do some positioning, write up a narrative, ideally with the framework that you just kind of walked us through. So I guess like what happens after that? Like once you have this beautiful narrative, what do you do with it? What stakeholders do you need to run it by? Who do you need for buy-in? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed it. Like at this point, I think you basically need to become an internal salesperson. And when we did a similar exercise at another job when I worked at Puppet, which was more like kind of redefining the existing category in which we played, we literally set up internal roadshows with groups of 5 employees at a time for like live reads of the narrative to get feedback, to improve it, but then also to like secure buy-in and basically get the whole company mobilized on the story and on the narrative. And, my take is like, if you're in a startup or a mid-stage growth company, that probably means like going all the way up to the CEO for feedback and buy-in, especially if you're working in a founder-led company. But if you're in a large established company, like the one that, you and I work for, Cisco, that probably means stair-stepping the narrative, up your leadership chain, maybe to like the CMO, the chief product officer, and the chief revenue officer would be like my realistic take. And, I'm a big fan, by the way, of starting with the sales team and getting their input and buy-in first, because it really goes a long way as you're internally selling toward making your narrative more credible. If you can point to like 5, 10, 20 folks on your sales team who are bought in and believe that that's the right story to be telling with customers, and the right category to be playing in.
Yeah, I want to double down on something you said to bring the sales team along with you and getting that buy-in. I made the mistake earlier on in my career where I knew to work with the product team, but then we're like, all right, the messaging's done. Like, let's roll it out to sales. And they're like, wait a minute. Like, they had a lot of really great feedback, but it caused some adjusting timeline and schedule and iteration on my end, but very early lesson in my career to bring the sales team along with you as you're crafting the narrative and the positioning.
Oh, for sure. I have like totally crashed and burned so many times in my career where I've like built messaging in a vacuum and then like presented it in a ta-da moment to the sales team, and nobody on the sales team has seen it or reviewed it. And it just like didn't land well at all. And so like I think you're totally spot on. Like the biggest thing you can do outside of what we're talking about today, just like anytime you're crafting new messaging as a PMM, is make sure that by the time you're doing like an enablement session to get it in front of your field, you can point to like 5 people in the room and say like, raise your hand if you helped contribute to the development of this narrative. If like your voice kind of came through in this, I think it really lends a lot of credibility to make sure that it's been pressure tested with the field.
And I will even say most leaders that I have presented messaging and positioning to, they will ask, has sales seen this? Has what does sales think? Or even in as I've been presenting to pretty senior folks at Cisco, we'll have, maybe the GM of the business asking, turn over to his or her counterpart in sales and say, have you seen this? What do you think? And it goes a long way when they have seen it. So there's so many proof points there. Okay, so now you've got everyone rowing in the same direction. Everybody's on board internally after however many iterations you have to take. So what happens after that? How do you actually get that market category to stick in the market?
Yeah, I think once you've got like the internal buy-in on the positioning and the story, then you need to actually activate that narrative externally. And I'll share kind of a couple examples. Like when we did this at Janrain and at my next company, again, the mid-stage growth company Puppet, that was trying to redefine the existing category in which we played. We basically started with like a full court press with the analyst community that wrote research for our buyers. And we did through like strategic advisories, briefings to share our positioning and customer stories and new innovations and routine inquiries to get feedback on it all throughout the process. And our goal was really to persuade the analysts that this was a big enough problem and a big enough market to actually categorize it, and then to steer their view of the market requirements, or to use like a Gartner term, like the critical capabilities, to align to what differentiated us and in kind of the goal of giving us an unfair advantage. And at the Janrain example I shared earlier at the beginning of my career, one of the main MarTech analyst firms called Kuppinger Cole, they eventually created a customer identity and access management vendor comparison report and named Janrain the overall leader. And when I was at Puppet and we were redefining our existing category, we were able to influence Forrester to create a wave report for the categories we saw it called infrastructure automation. And we were also named the overall leader. And so outside of AR, I think that's like the first place that I would sort of double down on activation, is to get the kind of external, independent, neutral validation that, yes, this is the category, because analyst firms play a big role in influencing buyers and end users, right? But outside of that, lining up category thought leadership and awareness campaigns also plays, I think, a big role in getting the category to stick. And some of the things that I've seen work well are state of reports. I'm a huge fan of those. We do at Splunk today, we do an annual state of observability report every year, and it is the biggest body of research on the planet for what it means to do observability well. Observability is the category in which we play. And, to give you an example, like last year, we surveyed more than 1,700 people to inform the report. And when I was at Puppet, I didn't have anything to do with this, but I worked with an amazing PMM named Alana Brown, who spearheaded an annual State of DevOps report, which was also the largest research of its kind. And we got a ton of mileage out of this report every year because it was an opportunity to reinforce the importance of our category, infrastructure automation, as like a key requirement for doing DevOps well. And I think some other ideas, like for playbooks that work well for activating your category, like more down funnel. I've also found it works well to create things like buyer's guides for your category, where it comes off as more like vendor neutral, but again, you sort of position the requirements or core capabilities in a way that maps to your differentiators. And then also golden RFP templates are great, to kind of, again, help steer buyer requirements in your favor. And then last thing I'll say, and I'd love your take on this, is if you're a B2B vendor, don't sleep on peer review sites like Gartner Peer Insights, Trust Radius, G2. Like, these are a great opportunity to hard code your like category into the taxonomy that these sites use to label your company. And since it's 2025 and we can't do a podcast without mentioning AI, I do think peer review sites are more important than ever. Like when you think about ChatGPT or Gemini kind of becoming like the primary interface that your prospects are using to research products rather than like visiting your corporate website directly.
Totally. Absolutely. Yes, I think you're spot on. And I would also recommend digging into popular forums for where your ICP hangs out, even like Reddit. I read an article somewhere. I can't remember where it was now. I'll have to try to find it. But it was an article that talked about where various generative AI tools get a lot, like source a lot of their information across the web. And for example, it lists a number of different sources, right? But like Reddit was one that came up for ChatGTP, just as an example. It's not, of course, not the only place, but one of the sources where it gets its information. So I think that's such a great idea to source that. You gave us so many tips and playbooks and ideas here. I want to circle back to some feedback you gave around getting the analysts buy-in early, particularly for B2B SaaS companies. I think that's so important. As someone who has had to put together multiple forms for the Gartner MQ or submissions and the critical capabilities and Forrester waves and all the things. And there are so many opinions about this. I've heard a lot of pretty senior leaders, both at small companies and large companies, who are of the opinion that like, oh, everything is pay to play. Like, oh, you only get into the leadership quadrant or the leader category if, you've paid some ridiculous amount of money. I disagree with that, actually, as someone who's been on the Gartner side and I've worked hand in hand with analysts. I disagree with that. I personally believe that PMMs should look at analysts as a partner or a sounding board in how they're developing messaging. But I don't have too much experience on this for category creation. So curious from your perspective, when you start engaging with an analyst on something like this, how do you go about it? Do you try to get their feedback first and let them kind of like think it was their idea? Or do you say, hey, here's what we think. What do you think? Is this what you're seeing too? Do you use them as validation? I guess like talk a little bit about what that engagement looks like.
Yeah. First off, I totally agree with you. By the way, like I don't think of analyst relationships as pay to play at all. I have literally worked in companies where there's been like a magic quadrant for our category where vendors have been named a leader that weren't even Gartner clients. So I think you're spot on. Like, the analysts, like you should think of them as trusted advisors and neutral experts on your market and a sounding board for feedback on product strategy, on positioning strategy, including like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today. And by the way, yes, they can become an influence, opportunity for you because at least in the case of like a Gartner or a Forrester, they're actually advising end user clients that you're also trying to sell to if you're a B2B company, right? So it's both for sure. But I would say like my experience with category creation is getting analyst feedback early on to help sort of kind of essentially be like market requirements to help shape the direction of your category narrative is really essential. And then once you've got that category narrative and that positioning like nailed down on paper, getting like either through strategic advisories, if you're working at a company that can afford that, or briefings where you can brief them on the positioning and then immediately follow that up with an inquiry where you just ask questions and just listen and get their feedback. I think that's the best way to pressure test it and validate it before you, kind of roll it out to the market more broadly.
Yeah, such a great tip. My personal experience from working on the vendor side with Gartner as an example, as we've developed out messaging for a net new offering, we incorporate some of their feedback and even their voice, their language into the narrative. And then when they hear it later, I like to think that it makes them feel good, that they see their own, contributions to our narrative coming out to market. So very helpful. Okay. And so you mentioned a couple of playbooks, like for example, the State of Observability, I think, report. What else do you do on the go-to-market side? How do you make sure like sales is enabled or the rest of marketing is rowing in the same direction? Like how do you take that beautiful narrative that you put together and got buy-in for and then put it into the market? What does kind of some of that stuff look like?
Yeah, again, I talked about internal roadshows with smaller groups earlier being the biggest thing that I found works to get like your sales team and your marketing team enabled on your category narrative. I am not a big fan of one-way communication channels like internal
I
webinars,
agree. Hate
for
those.
rolling out. Yeah,
No
for
one
rolling
attends
out,
anyways. Yeah.
right? And it's like it's not the right forum for rolling out new messaging. So it's obviously like a bigger time investment as a PMM to like have to roadshow and do the same thing with a bunch of small groups. But I think it's a better way to most importantly get like feedback from your sales and marketing teammates to pressure test the narrative and see if the work that you've done actually resonates or help have them help make it better. But then secondly, to actually secure their buy-in so they can carry that narrative down the field to customer conversations and derivative marketing campaigns and content. So I think that's to me kind of the key for getting it to stick and getting your sales and marketing teams to start to sing from the same playbook, so to speak, not to mix metaphors.
I love that. Yeah, so helpful. And then bringing it back to Splunk, I know you gave a couple of examples already. You mentioned when we were preparing for this conversation that rather than creating a new category for Splunk, your big task for Splunk was to attach your offering to this huge market of observability as a market category. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, talk about your approach to that and maybe what from the framework that you outlined did you use for this new task of kind of attaching Splunk to this existing huge market category?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe just a quick level set like on Splunk for anybody who hasn't heard of it. Yeah, so Splunk's a cybersecurity and observability platform. And what that means is we basically help IT operations, engineering, and security teams keep their software and their digital systems like their websites and their mobile apps and their supply chain management systems that they use to run their business. We help keep all that stuff up and running and performing and protected, from like security threats, for example. And of course, and this is why you and I are coworkers. Like Splunk was acquired by Cisco a little over a year ago. We're now operating as a business entity of Cisco. But if I can give a little bit of kind of the story as it relates to Splunk, it was very much a case of the third element I talked about in that decision tree toward the top of the pod around like attaching our brand and our company to an existing, emerging category. And so when I joined Splunk a little over 3.5 years ago, we were the clear market share leader in a segment called log management, which was being rapidly subsumed by a broader new observability category that, today has like a $23 billion TAM. And that observability category had emerged as a mashup of a bunch of once distinct software monitoring categories. And we had just made several acquisitions to expand our product portfolio for this emerging observability category, but we were kind of struggling with a perception gap where people still first and foremost thought of us as either a log management company or a security company. And we kind of lacked the unaided recall for observability among emerging buyers, for this category of tooling like engineering teams. And so when I got here, like we got to work sharpening our positioning to ensure that our strategic narrative sounded different from how, observability competitors talked, and that we were both, framing the customer problem a little bit differently, using our state of observability report findings as kindling for describing the promised land. And then also we took a lot of great care and attention to make sure that we were framing our differentiators in a compelling, clear way and persuasive way as basically the requirements to get there, like the requirements to achieve the promised land. And in the last 3 years, we've now been named a leader in 19 of the last 20 observability related analyst vendor comparison reports that have been produced. And we've seen big improvements in Splunk's unaided recall, among observability buyers. So I think like to kind of summarize it or put it simply, like we are far more likely to be immediately shortlisted and name dropped when observability buyers are asked to rattle off the names of leading vendors in the category than we were 3 or 4 years ago.
That's awesome. Yeah, it feels good to see some of the hard labor come to fruition as you start to see yourself, or not yourself, but see your organization become more prominent in the market. That's awesome. Okay, so let me just summarize a little bit because we talked about so much here. First up is a PMM would have to walk through that decision tree of, am I creating a new market category or, is it something else? And then it's crafting the positioning, which leads to the narrative, ideally leveraging the framework you provided, and then getting internal buy-in, being that internal salesperson for your messaging and your narrative, and then activating on that. And that's with you gave a ton of great ideas for top of funnel type of assets that you can do every year, which is great. And then getting analyst buy-in to help affirm this new category, and then all the way to enabling sales. So my last question for you, on this topic is what advice do you have for a product marketer who is trying to either pivot market categories or reshape theirs or create an entirely new one?
Yeah, I would say it's extremely hard to get a new category to stick, particularly when you're like using made up branded terminology. So my advice is be pragmatic and make sure that you're always putting the customer first. So, don't be too bullheaded about feeling like you always must create a new category versus attaching yourself to an existing one or redefining an existing one. And think about like the main goal of category creation again is to frame the position in your customer's mind where your product plays. And the reality is like if you create a category, if you try to create one that's too narrow or abstract or doesn't use customer language or doesn't immediately create that aha moment, when you describe it to your ICP, you're probably better off figuring out how to redefine and evolve the current category where you play or attach yourself to an existing one. And then unsolicited, but like, kind of one other piece of advice that's only semi-related that I coach like my team on a lot is like, if you're a PMM, particularly an earlier career product marketer, I'd say force yourself out of your comfort zone. And what I mean by that is often when you first get into product marketing as a career path, the initial focus is on becoming an expert in your own product and how it works and even competitor strengths and weaknesses. And that's all good and it's necessary. But I think the next step in product marketing awesomeness is to become an expert, not just on your own products, but on the broader market, your buyers, and the context in which your products exist. And a lot of the great PMMs that I've worked with, they actually make it their business to become experts in how competitors position themselves, how they go to market, including the ICPs and the segments that they target relative to us, where they have strong product market fit versus where they don't. Like how are they balancing product-led versus sales-led GTM strategies? And I think this type of strategic market insight not only helps you lead from the front when it comes to things like creating categories, but it also can set you up as a PMM for growth and leadership opportunities down the road.
Yeah, I love that tip. I think it's so helpful to help kind of readjust your thinking. And you're right, it is especially good tip for an early in career product marketer. If I look back to when I was really early on, I thought I had to be an expert in my own product. But then I felt like I wasn't, when I was showing up to conversations then with customers or partners, I realized that my knowledge kind of stopped there. But certainly after I went to business school and after my time at Gartner, I realized how valuable it was to come at it as if I were an external consultant or an analyst. And let me really understand my customer's problem. And to your point, the context that they're operating in. And okay, well, what are all of the possible solutions to this problem that I'm finding? And then digging a little bit into competitive intelligence. I love starting with what is the customer's problem that they're trying to solve? And not only how does my problem solve it, or how does my solution help with that problem, but also why. And same thing with our competitors. Why is our competitor's solution better? And that's where you really start to understand differentiators and when those differentiators make more sense for a customer. And you can relate all of this back to win-loss data. And there's so many ways that you can kind of connect it and drill deeper. So more conversations for another day. Well, awesome. Thank you so much. And that concludes the first segment of our show. So now it's time for the second segment, which is so much fun. It's the messaging critique. This is where we as product marketing experts get to analyze real world messaging. And the fun part is, Michael, you as my guest, get to pick the company that we talk about. So I've got 3 ground rules for how we do the messaging critique. After you tell us what the company is, first you're going to tell me what you love about the messaging or what stood out about the company. Then you're going to tell me something you wish the PMM would have considered differently as they were creating the messaging. And then finally, we're going to do a quick, fun brainstorm on where the PMM can take the messaging to the next level. Maybe it's some fun content that they can create or, creative campaign. So all of this is about refining our craft, meant to be no negativity, just thoughtful, constructive critique. So let's get into it. All right, big reveal. What is the company that you would like to critique?
Let's talk about Walnut, walnut.io.
Okay, so tell us about it. What is the product? Who's their ideal customer?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I feel like their messaging on their website is so clear that I feel like I can answer that question, even though I don't work there and I've never actually used their product. But basically, they are an interactive demo platform. So, a tool to enable B2B marketing, sales, and customer success teams to build and run interactive demos of their own products for prospective customers. And yeah, I feel like their target customer is kind of people like you and me, like I've spent a lot of my career as a PMM responsible for building out scenario based or use case demo scripts, to teach like our sales engineers on what to show and what to say when they're demoing our products to prospects. And I'd expect they would target PMMs who want to embed like an interactive click through demo of their product on their website in a free trial or a self-serve see try buy experience. And then I also imagine like they target sales teams directly, that want to be able to enable those sales teams with like, use case oriented demos to be able to show in a customer buying process. And I think there's probably a third persona too that I see from their website around targeting customer success teams directly who want to build like self-serve onboarding and adoption content for new customers, where you can use their product to actually demo the product for specific use cases.
Yeah, and it's so clear and direct. Right at the top of the page on their website, it just reads interactive demo platform for marketing and sales. That's exactly what it is. So there's no like, okay, what are they doing? I have to do some calculus to try to make sense of the buzzwords, as very many B2B SaaS companies do, unfortunately. Okay, so what else? You mentioned that it's very clear and direct. Anything else about the messaging that you're really loving?
Yeah, I just think like generally as a best practice, especially for B2B messaging, I think like good messaging kind of needs to do four things. It has to be relevant, like is it germane to your target audience and their day job? It's got to be differentiated, like does it sound different from how competitors talk? It's got to create like the immediate light bulb moments or aha moments, like it's got to create clarity, and then it's got to get you motivated. It's got to create like interest or intent. And I feel like, looking at their website, I feel like they kind of nailed all four of those things. Like, I mean, I'm looking at their homepage, they literally have a section that says who Walnut is for.
I love that. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Walnut.
Yeah, totally. It's like it's got audience specific use cases and value props. And then I feel like it's easy to quickly understand what they do. Also, like, they use like very clear conversational language to describe what they do, but they also kind of nail it. So what? And for what it's worth, and you talked about this earlier, Elle, like I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek and Start With Why, but I actually think when it comes to like B2B websites, you need to really quickly nail down what you do in order to orient visitors on your category. And I think Walnut does that really well. Like they start by declaring their category, they're an interactive demo platform. And then they quickly pivot to the benefits. And like you can see above the fold on their homepage, it's like give your audience a hands-on product experience, measure deal and prospect engagement, increase site conversion rates. Like if they just said those value props with no context on what they do or how they pay it off, it would sort of start to sound generic or imprecise. But I feel like you're better able to contextualize the value props when you first understand like, oh, they're an interactive demo platform. The other thing with Walnut that they've done a good job of is like they're kind of drinking their own champagne, right? So like, you look on the homepage, they've embedded an interactive demo of their product right there, like to show how their product works, which is like super meta, but it's actually a great way to like experience the product in less than 5 minutes and get a sense for what it can do and how you'd use it. And then I think last, like there's just not a lot of fluff that I see on their website or jargon. Like their messaging is simple, it's to the point, and it's just super easy to figure out like what they do and why you ought to care.
Yeah, like to your point, they give you the minimum information that you need to keep you to get you interested. And then just as you scroll, it's show, don't tell with a demo. And I think that could be really powerful. Okay, so what's something you wish the PMM would have considered differently as they were building out this messaging or this experience?
Generally, I am not a fan of like stylistic feedback because I think it's very subjective and personal preference oriented. So I'm going to kind of break my own ground rules here, but I'm trying to reach for like some things that they could maybe improve just to take it to the next level. But For me, like personally or stylistically, I always like seeing website messaging that's a little irreverent or whimsical. And I think B2B messaging, like it can be so dry at times, you know? And I think it really helps you stand out and gives prospects kind of the warm fuzzies when they think about you if you're a little bit more irreverent. And Walnut does like a little bit of this with headlines like why do top sales teams go nuts about Walnut? But I think they could lean in a little harder on this vibe, especially since like their ICP is primarily sales and marketing teams and growth companies, right? Like sales and marketing people tend to have a lot of personality. So I think they could embrace that a little bit more in some of their copy. I don't know. What do you think?
I was going to say the same. I felt like when I look at the top, while I very much appreciate that it's very clear, I understand exactly what they do, I understand the benefits right away. I wish it felt a little bit more like a story or like they made it more meaningful. Because right now it just feels, it's almost too generic that I don't even really like I'm not motivated to read it. You know, unless I really need a demo platform, I'm not super motivated to like continue scrolling. And I feel like the big image on the right, this like kind of interactive when you hover over it, it feels like at the very top right when you go to the side, they've got this quadrant with these little with the faces. And as you hover your mouse over each of the faces, a different benefit pops up. For example, when you hover over one of them, it says simplify pre-sales. I don't really know what that means. Or, I mean, I can guess at what that means, of course. Then there's streamlined customer onboarding, right? There's all kinds of little, I guess, benefits. I don't feel like that space, that real estate on the page is being properly utilized. I'm not sure if they're giving enough context to truly engage with their ICP just above the fold. I'm just not sure. I guess I'm not sold yet that this little interactive quadrant is doing the storytelling enough.
Yeah, maybe that's a great point. Like maybe what they could do more of is like depositioning the status quo, right? You know, is like kind of context or framing for like why you need an interactive demo platform. Like, hey, when somebody goes to your website and they just see like generic illustrations or static screenshots, like you don't get the aha moment. What if they could like click through and actually see your product in action with a 5 minute commitment? Like, you know, that like, I don't know, something like that could be a little bit more helpful for like lighting a fire under people why they need this
I
product.
completely agree. I like that their top line messaging, the header and subheader above the fold. I like that it's very clean and clear and helps me understand exactly what they do. But I think they can do more with, as you put it, like adding the why you should care. And I think you said like deconstructing the status quo and focusing more on that, like the customer problem and why I even need a demo platform to begin with. I see the benefits, I get the benefits, but I'm not sold yet. So I'm eager to see where they might take this a bit further. Any last thoughts you wanted to add on Walnut? And if a PMM from Walnut reached out to you and said, hey, can you give me some quick pointers? Well, what's kind of some big takeaways you might say?
One other, this may not be at all practical, but one other idea I had as I was kind of going through their website the other day was since Walnut is often used by marketing teams to build public facing demos that you would embed on your own website. I was reading through some of their case studies and I found myself wondering like, what would the product demo created through Walnut actually look like for some of the customers that are featured in this case study? And if they could get customers to agree to it, I think it'd be kind of cool for like their case studies to actually embed the example interactive demo that was built through Walnut for that customer's actual product. And I mean, put yourself in the shoes of like, you know, doing like vertical marketing campaigns or sales outreach sequences and be like, hey, this is how other vendors in your category demo their product with the help of Walnut.
That is such a good idea, right? Like an ABM style campaign for your, oh, I love that idea. We got to
Cool.
get someone from Walnut to run with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, maybe they're already doing it. We don't know, but very cool. Awesome. Okay. So before we go, I wanted to just pause and have a moment of gratitude as I like to do in all of my episodes. I feel like product marketing is so special because none of us get here alone. We're constantly learning from each other, building on each other's work. I'm definitely going to steal a lot of the playbooks that you shared today. And we're all better for it. So before you wrap up, I just wanted to say genuine thank you so much, Michael, for giving me so much of your time and giving the product marketing community so much of your time and your insights. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a lot of fun, and like I said earlier, like I've learned a lot from just listening to you and your other guests, and it's helped me level up as well. So big ups for what you're doing.
Yeah, we're so lucky. We're in this very generous community of PMMs. Well, I'd love to turn it back around to you and ask, who are one or two PMMs who have had a real impact on your career? Maybe this is a good time to give them a little shout out.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been really lucky to get to work with and for a bunch of stellar product marketers, but maybe I'll give a few names. Like one of my biggest mentors is Tim Zonka, who hired me at Puppet in 2014. He ran product marketing and then eventually became CMO there. And I learned a ton from him about how to be a better PMM. He's now the VP of portfolio marketing at a company called Commvault. And then another one who comes to mind is a guy named John Rooney. I worked for him at New Relic. He's now VP of product marketing at Unity. And he taught me a lot about how to manage PMM teams and then also how to work with executives and how to sort of operationalize product marketing frameworks. And then if I can, like one other person I'd love to give a shout out to is Gia Thiel. I both worked with and for her for a few years earlier in my career. She's, I think, now a senior director of solutions marketing at Equinix, and she is one of the best in the business at building credibility with sales teams and crafting sales messaging that actually gets used by sellers. So she's awesome as well.
You're so lucky. You had different mentors and coaches for like different parts of the product marketing career and different kind of focuses and emphases. That's really awesome. Yay. Well, thank you to those PMMs and those leaders for helping to shape Michael and letting him bring some of those experiences onto the rest of the community. And I promise this is my last question for you. Where else can we access your expertise? Is it best to find you on LinkedIn?
Sure. Yeah, I would not call myself an expert, but I'm always happy to connect with folks on LinkedIn for sure. Pretty easy to track down there. And then I also occasionally blog about product marketing and share frameworks and tips and ideas at theproductmarketer.com. So feel free to check that out too.
And your AMAs on ShareBird.
Yes. Yeah. ShareBird's an awesome community. If you're not a member, definitely go sign up. It's great to listen and learn from other PMMs like us.
Yeah. We love ShareBird. Awesome. Yeah. Again, well, thank you so much, Michael. This was so fun. And thank you, PMM listeners, for joining us on this adventure today. I hope this episode leaves you with inspiration to take in the next step of your own journey.